Okay, hello everybody. Welcome, Avedis. It's very good to have you back.
Always
For
a
those of
pleasure.
you, for those of you who don't know Avedis Seferian, he is the CEO of RAP, the Worldwide Accredited Responsible Production. They are a leader in sustainability and ethical business practices around the world. His talk today is called Responsible Sourcing in a Post-Pandemic World. We do have a chat box, and so if anybody has any questions along the presentation, please feel free to post them there. We'll get to them at the very end with a Q&A. And these slides will be available on the ATS slide share next week once we've compiled everybody. So if anybody wants access to that, just make sure you're subscribed to our emails. Without further ado, Avedis, please.
All right. Thank you, Jason. Always a pleasure to be part of ATS and this new experience of doing it virtually. And let's see how this plays out. As Jason said, I'm going to be speaking to you about responsible sourcing in the post-pandemic world. That's kind of where we're headed. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how we might be able to do things somewhat differently in the post-pandemic world than we have been doing in the world pre-pandemic. Here's what I got for an agenda for you for the next 20-25 minutes or so, and then we'll hopefully have plenty of time for question and answers. I'll have a quick introduction and sort of present to you my main theme, the thesis of the presentation. I'm going to talk about how we got here, a very quick look at sort of the evolution of the social compliance space leading up to the present time. And that'll be a good place to also pause and do a quick introduction of RAP for those of you who are not familiar with my organization. And then we're going to switch to asking, where are we going from here? What's that post-pandemic future looking like in the immediate term right now, and then down the path somewhat. And of course, how will we get there? What is the mechanism by which this new paradigm that I'm going to be proposing we hope to see come to realization? So the main theme, the main message I have for you is that we are all suffering through this pandemic, and yes, it's a true challenge, a real crisis, but in it lies an opportunity to reset the way we have been thinking about supply chain social compliance management practices, and to come up with a new paradigm instead of simply having a return to normal and sort of going back to the old way of doing things, which we have seen over the past several decades are not as efficient and not as effective as we want them to be. The old way of doing things has generally been characterized, at least from a historical point of view, of buyers and manufacturers often seeing each other as adversaries, as the supply chain is pitting one end of it against the other, treating compliance as an imposition of certain rules on mainly the manufacturers. That's sort of been the predominant model of how responsible sourcing of supply chain social compliance has been viewed. And it's been dominated by brands and retailers using their own proprietary social compliance programs. Everyone kind of telling their vendors, you got to be checked against our requirements, checked in our way, using our tool. And the result has been this pervasive phenomenon of audit fatigue that we are all aware of and all dislike and all seem, at least so far, unable to do much about. And this is an opportunity to change that. Attempts to do something about audit fatigue, those so-called harmonization attempts that the industry has seen over the course of the past decade and a half, have all failed. That's been one of the major lessons of our history so far, and they've all failed because the central theme of each one has been to try to get everyone to do things just one way. This whole let's all just do this one way approach just simply does not work. Harmonization isn't someone saying, everybody just do it this one way and then we can all harmonize. I mean, it's easy to say that if you all do it the way I do it, we have harmony. It doesn't work that way because there are multiple approaches and multiple mechanisms with multiple benefits and differing elements to them. So harmonization attempts have all failed. They simply do not work. So what is the new way of doing things? How can we get to that goal? Because that goal is real. That goal is something we all do want, harmony right? How do we get to that final goal? What is the path that will get us there, that will avoid the pitfalls that the past attempts have all fallen prey to? It comes down to this: seeing responsible sourcing centrally, philosophically, as a supply chain issue in its entirety, the entire supply chain, with all parties then having responsibility to follow rules and having a role to play in it, and not just an adversarial one at that. Transparency and collaboration as the main theme, as something that we're now, in a sense, being forced to do more of because of the pandemic. Learn from that, develop from that, make that a permanent way of doing things. And the core solution to the audit fatigue part is abandoning proprietary programs and instead taking a menu of options approach that utilize existing independent programs that are out there and doing a credible job, and thereby not have the need for multiple audits to be a feature of a compliance program that a brand or a retailer has because they insist on their own proprietary mechanism. Simply recognize the existing credible players. That becomes your menu of options. Any one of those will be able to proceed. It's a model that we're starting to see some big names, brands, retailers adopt. It's not the norm yet, but the vision here, the proposal here is that become the way that everyone does it, and then we eliminate duplicative audits as a direct result. All right, that's the big thesis, right? That's the main summation of my presentation. Let's take a step back and sort of walk through it, and we begin by looking back. How did we get here, right? I don't want to spend too much time on history of the evolution of sourcing. We're all familiar with this space. Half a century ago, owned and operated was still the predominant way of manufacturing stuff, especially in the Western world for brands, and it wasn't until relatively recently in time that the outsourcing model started to become the predominant way. And now it's essentially very, very rare to find a brand that still manufactures product in facilities they own and operate. Most of it is done through outsourcing, and that outsourcing is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not simply, in the country next door or jurisdiction next door. Supply chains now stretch throughout the planet. And one consequence of the outsourcing model for the buyers has been a decrease in visibility into their supply chain. They no longer own and operate the facility. They don't know what's going on there on a daily basis. And that has been the source of some problems and sort of the birth of the whole issue of social audits, because various exposés in the mid-1990s revealed some truly horrific working conditions in facilities being utilized by Western brands. And one reason for that was, again, that they had not had that visibility into their supply chains. And so to correct for that, the industry came up with this whole social compliance approach, promulgating corporate codes of conducts, and there was a whole proliferation of them in the 90s and up to today, and resulting social audits to then validate whether those conditions for engagement with their vendor bases are indeed being adhered to by those vendors. As the proliferation of those codes resulted in audit fatigue in brands and retailers essentially doing duplicative audits at factories because they were insisting on their own proprietary program, harmonization attempts started to emerge. They are a relatively recent phenomenon in the social compliance space, and they were done in two phases when you look at the sort of history of the past couple of decades. Initially, there was this desire to come up with a single universal code. Can we have just one standard that everybody requires of all their vendors? And that proved to be problematic because while most folks will agree on most things that they expect to see in a facility, the saying goes 90% of all these codes are the same. The challenge is that last 10% tends to be topics and issues that are of value to the specific brand or retailer, having to do with their ethos, their culture. And look, you can get to agreement on neutral topics and impose universality on technical things, but on value questions, it becomes impossible to get universal agreement. So the impossibility of that 10% made it so that the other 90 could not be agreed upon either, because you were not willing to sacrifice that 10%. And so the harmonization attempts evolved from trying to impose a universal code to saying, all right, can we at least come up with some kind of equivalency benchmarking mechanism? So we're not gonna say everyone's gotta have the same code, but can we get everyone to do the inspections of the codes the same way? Can we come up with a single solution there? And all those efforts have failed, whichever flavor they were, whichever phase in the process that they came out of, they've all failed. And they've all failed because the focus has always been on finding that single solution. The idea that there's got to be a one-size-fits-all way of doing it, and that just does not work. The famous adage about there being more than one way to skin a cat is true. And there's no single right answer. So what are we doing? What we're doing in trying to impose one is an exercise that is doomed to fail, because there is no single solution. So as I said, this is a good place to have an introduction of my organization, because in this evolution of various standards, the ones that ultimately have become the credible sort of world leaders are out there, and RAP is one of them. And for those of you who are not familiar with RAP, I wanted to just spend a couple of minutes talking about who we are. And we're the world's largest independent factory-based program, certification program. And we're focused on this industry, the apparel, textile, sewn products, footwear industry. There are all kinds of compliance programs out there that I'm sure you're familiar with that will certify across industries. Our thought has always been that it is better to be an expert in one area, to be deeper in an issue rather than shallower and wider, and not be as much of an expert, as much of a resource to others. So we've made the decision, and we continue to focus our attention solely to the sewn product space. Our industry scope may be limited, but our geographic scope is not. We certify, inspect factories all over the world. The W stands for worldwide. And the way we sort of describe ourselves in a nutshell is, we're an objective nonprofit team of global social compliance experts. That's who we are, professionals in this arena. And what we do is we promote safe, lawful, humane, and ethical manufacturing throughout the world. That's our core mission. That's what we do. And then how we do it is through certification. That's the main service of ours, inspecting factories and certifying that they meet our standard, and education, engaging with platforms like ATS and doing webinars like this, or talking to industry associations and the like, to try and get the message of why this matters and how we can help as far and wide as possible. And it fits. We've been a partner with ATS from the very beginning, and there's a reason why we consider that very critical to our mission. We've always believed that the way to get social responsibility as a norm in our industry is to engage with industry itself, to work directly with brands and retailers and manufacturers, and engage. Yes, we are an independent nonprofit, but we're not an agenda-driven NGO. We're not out there, to seek, to push our message through a name and shame campaign or anything like that. Our position has always been that engaging with industry, getting them to understand why and how to do this, is the most effective way to move forward. And so our approach has always been to position ourselves with industry, and we have become, as a result, a program of choice for industry associations. In the United States, the apex trade body for brands and retailers in apparel is the AAFA, the American Apparel and Footwear Association, and RAP is AAFA's official corporate social responsibility partner, CSR partner. We believe, as I said, in proselytizing the message through and to industry, because that's where effective change is going to be possible. And what is that message? What is that requirement? I don't want to spend too much time on the details. Happy to answer questions if there are any, or direct you to additional information on our website or elsewhere. But at its core, RAP promulgates these 12 principles that we inspect factories against to make sure they're in compliance with them. And they represent essentially what you would expect in any corporate code of conduct when it comes to core working conditions issues like no child labor and no forced labor and all the others that you see out there. On top of which, we also have additional value add by having some touch points dealing with the environment. And because most of the factories in our program, all of the factories in our program are export-oriented facilities, we make sure we also have customs compliance and security, which we benchmark to CBP's CTPAT program, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection's Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism program for security purposes. But as I said, happy to give more details, or you're welcome to peruse our website and learn about each principle in detail. I won't go into them over here. Instead, I'll simply reiterate the W in our name. We are worldwide. We believe very much in being where the factories are. It's not simply a program that's headquartered in Arlington, Virginia, that's trying to promulgate this issue around the world. Yes, that's where we are, but we have people for all parts of the manufacturing space: Latin America, in Europe, in India, in Bangladesh, in Hong Kong, for the Greater China region, and for Southeast Asia. We have full-time people in Thailand, in Vietnam, and Indonesia. The vast majority of our staff are out in Asia. Again, that's where the factories are, and that's where we believe we should be as well. I mentioned that RAP is the largest independent factory-based program for this industry, and I want to back that up with some figures. These are the top 10 countries where we had factories register for us with us for our certification last year, and it's no surprise that they follow the OTEXA guide list of garment exporters in the world: China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and so on and so forth. Overall, we received over 3,000 applications last year. That's how large our footprint is, and as of this point in time, early to mid, I guess not kind of early, more like mid Q2, there are almost 2,800 factories, I think 2,770 as of this morning, employing 2.7 million workers in 40 countries around the world that currently have a RAP certificate. So we have a very large footprint, and we're very proud of that. So we're one of these players. We're the biggest standard player out there, but as we've said, the space is crowded with brands and retailers using their own proprietary programs and resulting audit fatigue. So where are we going? What's the immediate future looking like, and where can we take this to that better place that I posited as the new paradigm at the beginning of this presentation? Well, here's an understatement for you, right? We're going through a period of great uncertainty and challenge. And this is our reality right now, and it's not going to change very soon. These conditions that we're in are causing major upheaval across the supply chain. It's not a geographically localized or industry localized issue. Sourcing models themselves are being questioned at the foundational level. Are we going to be able to go back to those extended supply chains? Are we going to really need to reconsider, nearshoring or onshoring again? Are we going to be able to have seasons that are, multiple and months long in planning? Are we going to be able to go back to that? And I think the honest answer is no. How much of that we can retain is still the area of discovery we're in, but there's no question in my mind that some of these changes that the pandemic has sort of already affected or is about to cause are here to stay. And fundamental changes are coming to the supply chain sourcing model itself at its core. For the immediate short term, right, these coming weeks, the rest of this quarter, the beginning of next, the challenge is simply safely restarting operations. How can we get back to a sense of normal with regards to placing orders, fulfilling them, shipping them, and then selling them in stores? And that's worthy of a seminar in and of itself. And we've been part of various efforts to provide guidance on things like keeping workers safe at the factory level, and at the consumer end of it as well. How do you reopen stores safely and to keep the staff and customers safe? I won't go into them. I just call them out as key short-term immediate challenges. Looking at this problem, looking at the past 3-4 months sort of at a remove, you can see that it evolved from what began as a supply side problem, sorry, when the thought was, one of our major sourcing destinations is going to have factories shut down for a while, to now a demand side one, right? Because even as those factories start to reopen, the question of whether they're going to be able to utilize the workforce to its fullest is an open one. Are we going to have the orders? What's happened to demand as we've all been stuck in our homes for the past 2 months or more, unable to go shopping, and now unclear as to what new consumer habits will look like. In the process, by the way, I don't want to lose sight of one important element here, that the purchasing practices of buyers has been and still is being called into question, as we're recognizing some of the challenges that the old ways of procurement are causing to factories around the world, and whether it's in Bangladesh or other parts of the world, that you see these real disruptions to the cash flow and the ability of factories to then pay their workers, to maintain responsible standards. So what's happening with social compliance? Where are we going there, and what's the immediate reality there? Well, obviously, in the short term, the past few months, there was this inability to conduct social audits, and that's starting to get better. We're getting more and more the green light to go ahead and revisit factories. But in the interim, a lot of attention was paid and interest was increased in the use of technology, whether it's, how can we do some of these things remotely or virtually, and how's that going to play out going forward? Social compliance at its core, the word social makes it so that I don't think we're going to be able to have audits be remote as a permanent feature, but there's no question that there have been a lot of interesting moves made and lessons learned from the challenges of this pandemic and the resulting necessity of temporarily going to technology-based solutions. And some of these will continue to play a role and add value to social audits going forward. But another interesting consequence in the short term was that it forced buyers to this place where they had to be creative, right? They were short of orders and short of suppliers, and for a while maybe couldn't do much. But whatever little they could do, they had to find other ways of doing, right? And part of it was exploring technological solutions, but part of it also was that buyers and retailers, brands and retailers, were forced to look at other options beyond insisting on their own program, because they couldn't use their own auditors. They couldn't go into that factory. So if I need to do some sort of due diligence, if I need to onboard this factory, what are my options if I can't use my own program? Well, let's see if they have a RAP certificate. That would give us a sense of assurance because somebody else has been in there. Let's see if another brand in our space can essentially give us some information because they've been there. So they've been forced to be creative and recognize that their own programs are limiting their options and not allowing them to be flexible. And that's really what I'm pitching here, right? I'm saying that it's time to make this temporary solution a permanent one. You've seen that it works. You've seen that it is a viable option in a pinch. Make it the main course. Make it how we now operate supply chain social compliance management as the standard paradigm. What I'm talking about is the menu of options approach that some major retailers already have in place, right? Where you're not going to have your own program. We're replacing proprietary programs. Not every different brand or retailer doesn't have to go in and do their own audit against their own code with their own standards, which is really the single biggest reason why we have audit fatigue, right? If we can stop the need for those audits, separate duplicative audits, we will greatly be reducing audit fatigue. And recognize really that there's no more, let's just all do this one way approach. It does not work. There is no one size fits all. It's not going to be a possibility. Different programs have to be allowed to move at their own pace, have to be allowed to evolve in directions that they choose and are important to them, while still making sure that there is that core due diligence function available to them, which a menu of options approach will give them a lot more flexibility and a lot more efficiency to be able to do. credible programs already exist out there. Obviously, RAP is one of them, the largest one, as I said, for this industry. There are other players out there that do this too. One of the reasons why brands had to start doing things on their own 25, 30 years ago when all this first began was because there were no choices, right? But now there are. There are professional, independent programs that do this, and frankly, are able to bring more credibility to the process because they don't have a vested interest in these factories. They're not looking to place orders in factories that they're checking. They're not the fox guard of the hen house. So use them as the menu of options. We also think that the future ought to involve more collaboration between these programs to further improve the model, to further make the efficacy of it, that much the richer. And that becomes even more important. Efficiency becomes even more important because social compliance is now inexorably marching forward, penetrating deeper into the supply chain, beyond the first tier, going on to tier 2 and tier 3 and so on. And so efficient models, flexible models, models that don't require brands to then layer on all kinds of overhead, and retailers, buyers layering all kinds of overhead on their shoulders, becomes that much more important. And there too, the menu of options approach is going to be much more useful and efficient. So how will we get there? What is the path forward? I've described essentially the end state, right? Well, we're in this crisis, right? Take advantage of this crisis. This is, if there is a silver lining here, that sounds callous to say, it's been a tremendously, horrific phase for the entire planet, but let's take advantage of it in ways that it allows us to, and make sure that we come out of this stronger. And as I said, buyers are already being forced to be more flexible, right? This is something that the felt reality has imposed on them. Let's not lose sight of that, and let's make that be the new normal. That flexibility and resiliency of supply chains. The key theme here, as I mentioned in my initial summation, is that this is a supply chain issue, right? It's not a buyer versus manufacturer issue. It's not a problem at just one end of the supply chain. This is a supply chain in its entirety issue. And we have to remember that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, right? If we are not going to be cognizant of the burdens that bad practices on one end of the chain are imposing on the other end of the chain, then we're weakening that link. And eventually the value of the entire chain diminishes. So think of it as a collective supply chain issue, not just one problem, not just a problem at one end of it. And therefore you now reimagine it in terms of transparency and collaboration, and understanding that we both need each other. This is the major lesson of the pandemic, right? The interweaving of these things. Problems in one part of the world have had effects in the other, and demand dropping off in one has caused tremendous economic problems in another. This is all one big interwoven supply chain, and we have to think of it holistically in order to get the solutions we want. Ultimately, it is about learning from this crisis and recognizing the need for more robust, more flexible, really more resilient supply chains. We've got to be able to handle these kinds of crises better, because I don't know about you, but I sure don't want to have to go through all this again anytime at all, let alone soon. Truly, when you boil it down to its essence, this is a question of sustainability. Can we sustain supply chains the way we were running them before? And the answer, as this pandemic has proven, is no. So we have to evolve. We have to get that more robust, more flexible, more resilient model. And that is the new paradigm that I'm proposing here in the form of that menu of options approach. And because this is the supply chain issue in its entirety, okay, there's going to be a role for all the actors in the supply chain, right? Whether they're ones that are directly engaged, right? The workers, obviously at the core of the supply chain, and again, understanding that they are not simply spectators in this, right? We want them more engaged, and we've seen some of the new models that have emerged on the social audit side as a result of the pandemic have focused on technologies that enable worker voice, and that as a resource, as something that can be looked upon as a valuable source of input. There'll be a role there. Manufacturers, I mean, as I said, this has traditionally been where the space has focused, and it's an unfortunate reality that they've tended, because there are so many different audits that they have to pass, to think of them as necessary evils, right? How can we minimize the cost? That's the only mentality that sort of speaks to them. Instead, they need to start thinking of this as an investment. Think of social responsibility as something that you are investing in for your own benefit and for your own growth and your own role in that supply chain, which will be a much easier ask of them if they're not being inundated by duplicative and unnecessary audits, right? If there is going to only be one, model that allows for them to truly focus on the actual substance of it, they'll be much better positioned to do that. And buyers, of course, I mean, as we said, the role ask of them is to abandon their proprietary programs. It doesn't serve them well. It doesn't lend credibility the way an independent certification would, because that program has no vested interest in the business side of that transaction. And it also will enable them to think about it not as a lessening of control on their part, but as a reallocation of resources, to be able to move away from doing the minimum sort of due diligence checks and into the areas that actually interest them, right? If you're a brand that is very environmentally focused, for example, that's your ethos, that's what your customers want, then you can have that much more resources available to focus on that and build on that, instead of having to dilute that to check all the minimal other stuff that you otherwise have to for social responsibility reasons. And then the compliance programs. I mean, RAP and our peer organizations in the world we're directly engaged in that sense, and we'll obviously have a role to play as the sort of the core of that menu of options, but also as organizations that should engage with each other a lot more, whether it's on things like mutual recognition, or whether it's on understanding, areas of expertise and being able to better serve the space. So it's a supply chain issue as a whole, as I said, and there are indirect engagement actors of the supply chain as well, chief among them and the governments, who again have a role to play. And the old concerns around, one of the reasons why these programs have needed to exist in the first place is because governments haven't been able to enforce their own laws effectively. I mean, that's something that I know continues to resonate, and governments need to understand their role. And here's the challenge, right? Certain parts of the world, there's governments trying to be maybe more active than perhaps efficiency would support. You've got to understand that government's role ought to be largely that big framework on rule of law, governance, and enforcement, and understanding that prescriptive sort of mandatory measures can be helpful and are needed in some areas, but can in fact actually be burdens in others, and where that balance lies and how to sort of thread that needle. Where do you go with sort of mandatory prescriptive approaches, and where do you use issues that are more carrot than stick is what the government's role ought to be, and being cognizant of that challenge there. Civil society, a very important part of the sort of overall cover around the supply chain and the role they play. Again, I would suggest that historically there's been a tendency for most of these NGOs to view industry in an adversarial light. And in this new approach, I think there might be more advantages to being more positively engaged and seeing them as a resource. I mean, for both sides to see each other as a resource, maintaining the independence that they need for their role, but being more engaged in sort of direct and collaborative, positive mechanisms rather than in an adversarial side. And then, of course, consumers, right? I mean, that's what all these supply chains are ultimately aimed at, getting product to consumers. there's a role for them. And increasingly, you're seeing that consumers are demanding more and more information. How credible and how sort of provable some of that information out there is still evolving. But as consumers make that demand and as they become more equipped and better equipped with the ability to get credible information, their ability to demand and reward good behavior through greater transparency and through their purchasing decisions will increase. And so the evolution that we're looking to see here is from sort of consumers what we call the old conspicuous consumption to more of a conscientious consumption, and one driven by information and as I said, rewarding good behavior through purchase through consumer action. So that's sort of it. I mean, that's the big picture. I promised I wouldn't speak too long. I wanted to make sure we have time for questions. I'll leave you with a teaser here coming soon. RAP will be releasing a white paper examining this further, sort of expounding on this new paradigm for supply chain social compliance management, and it's going to be coming out next week. And we even have a fancy term we're going to be using to describe the model, which I won't be revealing just yet. You'll have to wait for the paper to see it. With that, I want to thank you for your patience. I think we already have a few questions coming in, and I'll hand it back over to Jason, so we'll use the rest of our time to engage in discussion with the folks who are listening here. Thank you all again very much.
Thank you, Avedis. That was a really great presentation. As always, very thorough, full of very useful information and an interesting perspective on what's going on right now. So I think everyone would agree with what you're saying. So thank you very much. Got two questions here so far. Do you have any advice for someone trying to re-enter the apparel industry after being gone for over 30 years?
Wow. Congratulations on that hiatus. I'm guessing that you were in some other industry for all that time. And hopefully you've been keeping some tabs on this industry, because the last 30 years have really been ones of tremendous change. The space has evolved, as I said, from 30 years ago, you would still more or less expect owned and operated to be, if not the norm, then certainly a representative model. Now it's very, very different. And so I guess the question, I would break it down further to say, what side of the industry are you entering? If you're going to be coming into the sourcing side, then that's a whole nother kettle of fish. If you're coming in on the compliance side, I could certainly speak to that a lot more. And that would be an area that's seen even bigger change, right? Because 30 years ago, there was no concept of a social compliance certificate, whereas now it's standard operating procedure. So I guess I'd advise you to sort of determine with a little bit more specificity what area it is you're coming back in. And the good news is, with sort of modern communication networks, the ability to find someone who specializes in what you want to come back into is a lot easier. And I would seek them out and sort of get them to bring you up to speed on what's evolved. And as I said, if it's the compliance area you're interested in, then I'd be happy to be that person for you and carry the conversation on from there.
Yeah, and I think one other benefit to getting back into it nowadays is that the communication avenues are much more transparent. It's much easier to get a hold of representatives to ask those questions if you don't know which direction you want to go into. If it's sourcing and trying to find out where to find suppliers, there's a whole host of companies that do that, like ATS, for example.
Indeed.
And then if you want to explore what options you have for the compliance side, I think people forget also that RAP has a very involved department that are there just to help people answer those questions and guide them in the right direction. So definitely use these resources that Avedis and others are talking about. And at the end of the day, just pick up the phone and give them a call, because they're all happy to help, and that's what they're there for. So
that is right.
Okay, we have a couple more here. What do you see as the biggest need in the industry has currently?
Wow. talk
That's
about
kind of a broad question, but I think
big
coming
question.
from your area, I suppose,
Yeah.
of the industry.
So I can answer a little bit more specifically from my area, but I'll answer the broad question with a broad answer. I think one real problem this industry has and continues to have is our tendency to think short term, right? Some of that's driven by just the way sort of markets work now, right? Especially if you're a publicly traded company and you got to have those quarterly reports, and those numbers really drive a lot of the thinking and the behavior. But it is not a good paradigm, right? If you start to think about some things longer term, then you will see that behavior that is best suited for long-term success is very different from the kinds of things you're doing if you're only looking to that next payroll or only looking to that next quarter's results. So if you want a philosophical broad answer to that broad question, it is this thing that the industry needs most, is this kick in the pants to start looking much more long term. And then I'll boil that answer down to sort of what the biggest need for the industry is for our space, right? And sort of harken back to my central theme here. It's the short term approach that led to all the brands deciding to do things their own way. Right? And I understand the attraction, right? Control, the sort of, being able to make it just so. And that might be a viable position if you were the only player out there, right? In the short term, it works for you. But in the long term, and given that that behavior is causing that vendor that not only has to deal with you, but deal with 20 others, each of whom is imposing their own requirements on there, that much more pain. If you looked at it long term and saw that consequence and saw that the way this was going is not productive, you would be in a much better place, and you would have arrived at what we're saying we should be arriving at right now much sooner, right? This whole menu of options approach, doing away with a one-size-fits-all approach. So that's what we need, is that philosophical adjustment, which stems from being able to pivot and think long-term. Look, I recognize that's easier said than done, right? Right now, if your factory is on the brink of financial ruin, or if your brand is on the brink of collapse, and many of them are declaring bankruptcy, you cannot help but think short term. I understand that. What I'm hoping at least is once that immediate crisis is resolved, we don't go on thinking short term. We realize that, all right, now we've got to not let this happen again to us, and we'll start thinking longer term about that. So that's what I'll say. I'll say for that.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point that I think every time we speak, Avedis, you hit on that. It's not just about trying to help the earth and help society and help everything else like that with labor laws. Sustainability is also that long-term play you're talking about, is about brands being able to be in existence in terms of decades rather than just years, right? Because the turnover is very high in this industry for some reason, and part of that is likely due to the fact that the business practices are focused on the short term, the quarterly results versus on But as you just stated, the landscape changes for many reasons, and this is a very good example of one that very few people could have foreseen. It wasn't an economic situation to begin with; it was an act of God, if you will, with that term. But these are storms that need to be weathered in a much more long-term fashion, because those are more robust business structures that can weather these types of issues. So let's see if we have any more questions here. I think that's all we had today. Kevin, do we have any more from Facebook? Look like it. Okay, well, I guess we'll cut it there. Again, Avedis, thank you so much for being here. Look forward to seeing you in Canada in November, in person this time, hopefully.
Hopefully,
and,
hopefully.
Yeah.
Indeed.
So.
Yeah, no, the timing works out great. I appreciate it. Thank you all for your attention. I really do hope that, the crisis that we're all struggling through right now leaves as its legacy, not just the negative stuff that we are all aware of and sort of all mourning, but also a positive result in a albeit forced mind shift, but nonetheless one that actually is a positive in the long run and able to take us to a better place as a more robust, more resilient, more sustainable supply chain. Thank you all very much.
Absolutely. I think that's what we'll see. Take care, Avedis. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jason. Bye-bye.